Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today's position is a doozy here. With the white pieces is former world champion Botvinnik, and with the black pieces we have former world championship contender Flohr. This game comes from the 1944 Russian championship. Most of you know who Botvinnik is. Like I said, former world champion. He was born in was then known in Finland, uh, and then he was moved by his parents to Russia at a very young age. He learned chess. Um, he is basically known as the patriarch of the modern Russian chess school, right after Shigorin. And he started, of course, the Botvinnik Chess School, which is very famous. Many strong grandmasters attended that school. Gary Kasparov, Karpov, to name a few. And he basically ushered in the modern era of chess with all the preparation, the rigorous analysis, etc. He had a very well-rounded style. Uh, believed planning, very strong end game, um, and multiple time champion. Floor, a little bit less known, but Floor lived a pretty long life, 1908 to 1983. He was born in what is today now known as the Ukraine. He's of Jewish descent. Um, he was orphaned during as his parents were killed in a massacre in World War I. And he wound up in Czechoslovakia where he learned chess. Um, his prime chess years were in the 1930s. For example, from 1929 to 1933, he was considered the most serious challenger to Alexander Alehin, although he had a terrible record against Alehin. But he his problems probably were more psychological against the world champion. But at that time, in those 4 years, he was considered the most serious challenger. It reminds me of Shirov and Kasparov in the 90s, where Shirov had a terrible record against Kasparov. But he was a very strong player and considered a contender for the world championship. So he kind of hit his stride in the 1930s, but after the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia, he fled to the Soviet Union, and this is where he becomes a citizen. Again, you've got to remember he was a Ukrainian Jew, so um, it was his best interest to get out of Czechoslovakia after the Germans invaded, and he went to Russia and became a Soviet citizen. And then after that, he was still a very strong player. This game is from his first Russian chess championship, his debut, and he wound up having a respectable fourth place. And he even said of his own results, like after the 1930s, that basically he said the war severely affected his health and nervous system, and that he basically lost motivation to work as hard as he uh, could have. So he's a very strong player, and now we're going to dive into this position. Botvinnik has the white pieces, Floor has the black pieces. Is white to move, so Botvinnik is to move here. And this position is fascinating to me because it looks, it just has a little bit of everything. You see black here with the perfect pawn structure, right? Textbook pawn structure. His king is close to the center, although it's on the his second rank. And white's pawn structure is all ugly, right? The isolated pawn and D file, the two B pawns. Uh, and plus black has the 3-2 king side majority, so it just looks kind of ugly for white. But upon close analysis, we can see that white is actually better. And I'm going to tell you exactly why white is better here. One, let's look at black, right? Black has basically two advantages in this position. One is that 3-2 king side majority. Again, this is a theoretical advantage. 3-2 king side majority, and he has a better pawn structure, which we've mentioned. However, white has four things going for him in this position, right? First of all, he has a better king, right? Notice his king is closer to the center, and it's up to his third rank, right? So um, white's king is going to be faster than black's king in any kind of race at this point. Two, white has more central control. Notice again where the king is and exerting influence over these squares, and not only central control here, but he occupies another key central square. So the only square that black really has say over in the center is e5 here. The third thing is the advanced pass pawn here. Although it's isolated, it's advanced and it's dangerous. There's nothing blocking it, right? So it must be stopped by the black king. The black king is the only thing that can stop this pawn. Okay, and that's a liability in itself. The fourth thing is that um, white has three very powerful squares at this point that black has to worry about. And that's e6, a5, and b5. Okay, these are very strong for white. And if black is to play b6 at some time, then he has to worry about this square also becoming weak. And now, how do I determine which squares are weak or strong? Well, for me, what I like to do is I look at the influence of my pawns in the opponent's or pieces, but in this case pawns. I like to look at the influence they hold in the enemy's territory. So I draw this imaginary line between the fourth and fifth rank. You know, the imaginary line between these two ranks, and I look at the influence because from the fifth rank to the eighth rank, this is the black territory, and from the first rank to the fourth rank, right? Like if we made this imaginary square, this would be white's territory. So the way I determine which strong squares for white, for instance, or places that white has infiltrated in black's territory that black cannot put a piece on or move a pawn safely to. So, for instance, a5 and c5 are very strong for white because for white, yes, because black cannot move his king there, for instance, or if he had pieces on the board, he couldn't land a knight there or a bishop, or he can't even advance his pawn to this square because it would be captured. So these are very strong squares for white. Same with this square. Okay, now I didn't say c6 because c6 is being contested. Okay, but that is a good square for white also because black cannot use it, and these are squares in his own territory. And this is a good sign for the stronger side when you're starting to take space away from your opponent, right? Is that's he can't even use his own um, property, so to speak. All right, so if you look at white has three very strong squares, whereas if you look at the black side, black is not um, challenging any territory on white side of the board. Okay, if you notice, black's pawns have not reached down to his own fifth rank to where he can really challenge um, white here. So this space is a advantage for white also. So that's why I say white has the advantage. He has about four things going for him in the position versus two things for black. All right, so now that we realize that we're better as white, like now it's time to kind of work on like a general plan here. All right, now we could look and we could say one idea would be to try to attack the the queen side, right, by following this path here, right? Attack this B pawn, right? Also, of course, protecting this jewel in our position, the D pawn, but perhaps using it as a decoy. There's only two things that we really can do with this passed pawn. One is use it as a decoy, and two, if the opponent, slips up and lets us queen the pawn, of course, make a queen. But of course, a strong player is not going to just let us waltz up the board. So most likely or not, it'll have to be some type of decoy, whereas it ties the king down to his defense, right? So here's one idea is to just try to walk here and attack this b6 pawn, and of course subsequently the b7 pawn and a6 pawn, and then try to promote these pawns. That's one idea. However, upon further scrutiny, we can see that that idea, although it's good or sounds good on paper, can easily be stopped by b6. All right, so once b6 is played, there's no way that white can really penetrate into the position. Okay. Um. So you have to come up with some type of alternative. And although this is a great pawn to have, again, there's no way to get in front of it, right, and control the key squares in order to promote the pawn. All right. So the pawn is pretty much good as a decoy, but after b6, how do we get in a position? And this is how uh, the logic that Botvinnik uses to come up with the plan that we're going to actually see over the board. So first, I'm going to show you this first idea of just trying to go after this pawn. So let's say d4, b6, and you notice now you can't get in. And let's say g4, e7, king e4, king d6. All right, so the black king is tied down. h4, and now a5. Takes. Let's say h5, g takes a4, f5, and you can see both sides end up queening, and nobody is going to be able to win that game there. So going back, we can see this idea with b6 kind of stops white's plan of just invading the queen side. Right after b6, it's hard to fulfill that plan. Now, of course, if black was not that good at chess and played a move like f5, let's say he just tried to get his pawn majority rolling, then the plan works beautifully. King c5, king e7, king b6, and say king d6, and then you can see the idea perfectly illustrated as black tries to push his pawns, but it's just a little too slow. Okay, so that's the first plan, but we see that unfortunately it doesn't, it's not going to work. Another idea is the g5 right away, but that's no good either. So going back, in this position, Botvinnik played g4, and this is a second plan, and what this plan is called is minority attack. Now, what's the goal, or what is a minority attack? The reason why it's called a minority attack is because you have two pawns attacking three pawns. So you're in the minority and you're attacking. So that's why it's called a minority attack. What's the purpose of the minority attack? The purpose is to create pawn weakness. All right? And you're either trying to cripple the majority, right, so that a passed pawn can't be created. So for example, if black played g5, Now it's impossible for him to advance these pawns. So even though he has a majority, his pawn majority is crippled. He would have to then, say bring the king here and then try to force the pawns forward. So that's one purpose of a minority attack, is to cripple the majority, to render them immobile, or to create a weakness in the position whereby um, the pawns could be captured, or via the open lines that are created. All right. So what makes this possible is all of this possible is this very strong pass pawn. So after g4, king e7, h4, king d6, and now Botvinnik protects the pawn as he must. e4, and now b6. Black is in a form of Zugzwang here, and he doesn't want to move his majority because anything he does is going to create the weaknesses that we talked about. So for instance, if he plays h5 here, then just simply g takes, and now f5. You see, king f5. This is going to fall, and this is going to fall. Black can't protect because he's bound to stop this isolated pawn. Again, if h5, now of course white would have to be real foolish to play a move like g5, because then this works out for black, of course. And now black realizes his goal of creating the passed pawn. But any player worth his salt is going to play h5, g takes, h5, g takes, and then it's pretty much over. This is why Flohr played b6. Botvinnik continued h5, g takes h5. There's really nothing else to play. If g5 here, then just, you had the same story. King f5, and then of course if the king tries to leave this pawn for any reason, that's when the decoy comes into effect, and eventually the black king will be forced to capture the d pawn, and then these pawns will drop. Another idea is f5, g takes, and then f6, h4, f7, and white's attack is I'm sorry, not f7 here, just simply king f3, stopping this pawn, and then again black is bound to these pawns. He can't really move at this point because this square is guarded, e6, and e7 is guarded. So basically all he can do is just wait for the execution as black loses these pawns. So this is why Flohr tried to avoid doing anything with these pawns. So we can see that the minority attack has been successful. So g takes h5, g takes h5, and now we see the open lines created. a5, Botvinnik just simply ignores because he can, and you can see how the double pawns are usually, again on paper, we've looked at as a weakness, and we can see here that they're actually very strong for uh, Botvinnik here. If he didn't have double pawns here, he would be forced to capture, and then black would have this passed pawn racing down the board. But since there's two pawns, he can just give up one of the pawns. It doesn't matter. And this is what gains him time. So king f5, a takes b4, king takes f6, king takes, king g6, king e6. So he realizes that, hey, if he goes after the pawn, he's lost. And again, it's only by tempo. So for instance, king c4, king takes h6, king b3, king g6, king takes b2. Notice on the diagonal. So that's bad. King h6, b3, h7, and you can already see a2, queen, b2, and it's just too late. And that's just one move. You can see one move is important between drawing and losing. So this is why after king g6, Flohr played king e6 because he realizes that there's no use going after this pawn, and he's trying to create a position whereby um, where he gains the opposition and black is stuck. He's going for this draw. King takes h6, king f6. Now b3, king to f7, and now king g5, king g7. Again, notice the use of the pawn again as a decoy. King h6, king e5, king takes, and now all black can hope for is a drawn king and pawn endgame. King c6, king f5, king takes b6, king e6, king d7, and king takes b4. Now you should just be able, if you know your king and pawn endgames, you should be able to glance at this position and tell if it's a draw or win for white, like immediately. Okay, believe me, both players already know. So now it's just a matter of testing technique. So here, the critical information that you need here is, if you're white or black for that matter, if you're trying to draw, is you need to know what the key squares are. The key squares are the squares in front of the pawn that, if occupied, will allow you to win the game if you're the stronger side. So for example, this pawn is on the third rank. The key squares here are a5, b5, and c5. Okay, and these squares change as the pawn advances up the board. All right, I have another video on that on my channel also, entitled "What Are Key Squares?" So if you want to learn more in detail about that and see more examples, just check out that video after this one. But as the pawn moves past the border, right, between the fourth and fifth ranks, then instead of just having one set of key squares, there will be or three key squares rather, then there will be six. But what this means basically is that if Botvinnik can um, enter into any one of these squares with his king, that he will be able to uh, promote this pawn. All right, and it's black's job to try to prevent that. So with this knowledge, when you have this knowledge from this position, you can already see that uh, black is lost here. Why? Because there's nothing that black can do to stop Botvinnik from at least entering into one of those key squares. So Flohr plays king c6, and there it is, king a5. All right. To give you another example, let's say if let's go back. If white didn't know what he was doing and played a crazy move like king c3, for example. Remember, the critical squares are right here, or the key squares are right here. So king c3, just simply king c5, and notice white cannot get to these squares. King c2, and you can play around all day, and it's a draw now because there's no way to get to these squares. Of course, Botvinnik didn't do that. He played correctly. King a5, and now king b7, king b5. Notice how Botvinnik stays in those key squares. King a7, king c6, and now he's ready to advance the pawn. King a6, b4. Same thing. Now that the pawn is advanced, the key squares are now here. But Botvinnik is in a good place because he's already there with his king. King e7, b5. So now the pawn has crossed this imaginary border between the fourth and fifth ranks. So now, instead of just having three key squares, it's six. And these are the key squares now. So king b8, and king b6. Again, occupying any of these squares is fine. And here, Salo Flohr resigned, as the king will just be squeezed out. So, for instance, if king here, then again, occupying one of these squares, and what are you gonna do? And then the pawn would advance and uh become a queen. So that was a very interesting game. Interesting ending and instructive ending. From I don't know what I think is like a real ugly pawn structure that Botvinnik had, but it shows you that if you have certain elements in the position, that it will override a lot of the negative aspects. In this case, it was this killer pass pawn right here that that was so powerful that it was able to negate the negatives. For instance, these pawn islands in Botvinnik's position in these double pawns, right? Just this pawn alone negated everything, and it created the atmosphere where he was able to launch this minority attack. So that was a great plan, and also he showed a lot of great insight and not going for this obvious looking plan. He was able to calculate that, hey, at the b6 there's really no progress there, because if he took a step toward the queen side with his king and then realized that wasn't a good plan, then he wouldn't have had time to queen because of this lost tempo. So for instance, if he goes for the same plan here, king e7, right? Matter of fact, let's not even let's ignore the pawn like he did in the actual game. H5, G takes. So this is the same play as in the game, with just that lost tempo of white going to d4 as if he was going to attack the queen side first, but then he realizes, hey, I made a mistake, and he goes back. King f5, and notice the difference. Instead, black doesn't have to follow white to the king side as he did in the game. Instead, he has time to go and capture the pawn on b2. And you see they both queen, and the game's going to end in some kind of perpetual. And that's all because of white taking that time to play this move king d4. However, in the game, Botvinnik saw this and rejected the plan uh, as a faulty plan altogether, and just went for g4 right away. And he started with his minority attack immediately, and he only moved the king when he had to protect his pawn. And notice when he did move the king, he didn't move it closer to the queen side. He just moved it up the board. So he's actually gaining time to attack over here. b6. And then you can see with the added time, then he, of course, ignores this capture of this pawn. And now black does not have the time to capture this pawn. All right, so let's wrap this up. So in conclusion, we can say, right, that minority attack is very powerful, a very powerful tool. Also, the passed pawn is extremely powerful tool here. Okay, and also that is very important not to waste time, because you can see if you lose like one tempi, the game would have been a draw there. So again, I hope you like that video. Please support my channel in the donation link below. This video has helped you, and also check for further videos on my channel down in the box below, or DVDs related to the end game, which is very important if you want to become a strong player, to learn how to analyze and think properly in chess. Also, I am on live chess. If you want to play speed 1 minute games, that's all I play on live chess. So if you want to hit me there. Also on Twitter, the same name is on YouTube, Chess Audiobooks. You can see me there also. And if you have any questions or games you want me to look at, just hit me in the comment section. All right, so I'll see you guys in the next video.